mate. And this is quite an interesting theme in Endgame Studies. So let's just start out with some basics. So here we have king, bishop, and knight. And the king is in the right corner from white's perspective because it's the same color as the bishop. This is the only corner where we can mate under normal circumstances, at least. And let's just see some basic movements. If white to move, bishop h6, for instance, could also be bishop a3. So the idea is if you have king, bishop, and knight, let's say, or king or two minor pieces, you use king and one minor piece to trap the king in the corner. So it's only two squares. And then you get in the other minor piece, and then you checkmate. So just very quickly, we can bring the knight to f6. Just want to very quickly show you the mating pattern. And it actually doesn't matter if white to move here, then we get this mate. And if white to move first, then we can, if black is to move, then we just move the knight first. So the knight goes here, bishop here, either way. So it's going to be a mate. So, but this is the very basics. And this is even before we start adding more pieces. So the core of all the positions we're looking at today is bishop and knight, and then we have an opposite colored bishop here on a6. And you probably see how should white win this game. You can put it in the chat just quickly. So it's a very nice idea, and it shows that this idea of opposite colored bishops, the attacker profits from that actually works with reduced material as well. Yeah, Omar, you're right. So this is a very nice idea. We need to box the king in. Yes, you got it. And now there is no stopping the king going to f8, followed by bishop g7. Or an even faster way is probably to move the bishop to f8 and get the king to h6 and then maybe bishop g7. Either way, black is helpless because it's opposite colored bishops. So this is very much the core of what we are doing today, of course with more complicated positions and all that. So I will unshare for a moment and then I will put up our plan for today. Let's see. Just to give you a brief overview. So, basic mating patterns. So mate in the right corner, opposite colored bishop, that OCB. So then we have mate in the right corner, and black can have a pawn on h7. There's some studies there. Then it could also be not in the corner, but on the edge of the board. There are also a lot of studies like this. Then it could also be on the edge, but combined with a trapped opposite colored bishop. There's quite a few studies like this as well. And then we have endgames where we have our two minor pieces against one, but one pawn each. And although it is the wrong corner, we can somehow combine mate with positional threats of winning that extra pawn. So here is a little bit of combination. I will show you a position. That actually happens quite a lot in normal endgames played out. So this is not so much study. Well, it is made as a study and it's in the study database, but it looks more like a real game. Then we have this idea of king and bishop and two knights is mating against an opposite colored bishops. And this is interesting because in itself it's funny to think about. It's interesting to think about, but also if we have more pieces on the board, let's say 3 minor pieces versus 2 minor pieces, or 4 versus 3, there are even some studies here. Then if the defender starts to trade off minor pieces to ease the defense, then sometimes it gets down to this king and bishop and two knights versus opposite colored bishop. So the clue here is a little bit the opposite colored bishop and the right corner. Then there's a lot of things going on. And I have one or two very pretty, one fun in-game studies. So I added that at the end. So this is basically what we're going to do today, the first hour. And then we have the puzzles for half an hour, and then we have feedback on the puzzles for the last half an hour. So let's get back to the board. Okay, we saw how this was winning, so let's move on to the next position. So this is white to move and win. And so the core is still what we just talked about. There are just additional ideas in this endgame study. And good endgame studies, they have more than one idea. So let's try to find out what the problem here is for, sorry, I need to share my screen. Here we go. So white to move and win. As I said, we have to remember the core idea, but we also need to use additional ideas. So the bishop on a6 is attacked. And here we actually have this idea in action that bishop, two knights, and king is a mating force against an opposite colored bishop. So assuming that these two black pawns are not going to be dangerous, we are going to win them over time, and then we can mate black. And black can try to exchange the bishop for one of the knights, but then we still have king, bishop, and knight left to mate the king. Okay, so this looks great for white. If he can just keep the pieces, then he is winning. So we can start by moving that bishop, but here's the problem. When the king moves, it's a check, and then black has this idea of bishop d4, forking the two knights. Okay. So king to b7, let's say. So there are not too many other options, because if the king goes to a5, let's say, bishop d4 doesn't work because of either knight c6, but also knight b3. So the king has to go backward towards the corner. King b7 is the only way. And then bishop d4. So this looks like a huge problem for white. If black wins this one piece back and the king is not trapped in the corner, then we just have a draw. So, but white has a very nice move here, which is knight to b3. Black takes the knight, and then knight a5 check. And let's look at this position for a little bit, because black has 5 legal king moves, but 4 of them will lose the bishop to a knight check, directly or indirectly. So what is the only move for the black king? What is the only square for the black king here? Let's try to figure out what's going on in this critical moment. So we can already rule out the 2 first moves, because then a knight fork will pick up the bishop. Oh, actually 3 of the moves. Yeah. A8, B8, B6. A8 is actually okay. We'll see that. A8 is the main move. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. King a8 is okay because bishop f3 we have c6, which is disturbing white's coordination on the way to getting that bishop. So how does white win the bishop now after king c8? So it is king a8 in the main line because this move drops the bishop. How does it drop the bishop? Yeah, Matt, you're correct. So we have this little check on g4, and then black has to step to one of these squares, and then we have a knight fork on c6. So it turns out that there's only one move, and that is king a8. And now bishop f3, if king moves, then knight c6 forks the bishop again, but we can play c6. And knight takes bishop f6. This is just a draw because the king will get out of the corner now. And if bishop takes, then we just move the king because then there's no fork on c6. So here again, we have a draw. Under normal circumstances, this is just a draw. It's only if the king is trapped in the corner. So how do we do it here with white? We change the move order. So knight to c6 first, attacking the bishop. Bishop moves. And then bishop to a6 is trapping the king in the right corner. So this is our core idea. And it looks like white is just winning. White can bring the king to c8. Or white could try here and bring the king to a6, either way. But since there's a little detail here, that's the g pawn that gives black some counterplay. So g5. And now we can move forward while keeping this pawn under control. So we can get as far as f5. Sorry, one moment. My screen got stuck. So bishop e3. And now white is in time to checkmate before promotion happens. So, and then mate with bishop b7. So that was our core idea, but with a few twists on the way. So let's just jump directly to the next position. So here's another one with the king in the right corner. The composer has added a few pieces, but we still get down to that same core idea. So let's just get familiar with this idea. So this study starts with c6. And if the king moves, yeah, I should start by saying that if white takes this bishop, then rook takes c5, and white is not able to keep this pawn on a7. Something like this, we can just take the knight out, and then we have a draw. So white cannot take that bishop on f2 right away. So the first move is c6. And now if king takes a7, we have knight b5 winning the rook. That could be something like this, let's say. But now because the bishop is attacked, we get to keep this pawn. So if black moves the bishop away, then we just defend our pawn. And if black tries to attack this knight on c3, and then afterwards he can take the pawn. What's the winning move for white here? Yeah, I get knight b5 and c7, the same idea. So the idea is supposed to be c7. So now we're talking about move orders. Does it make a difference? I believe it does, because knight b5, I think I can play bishop e5 and stop the pawn. And then if the bishop tries to defend the pawn, then the knight is hanging on b5. Let's see, something like this. It looks like white will lose material here. So it has to be the opposite move order, c7. King takes knight b5. And then if it doesn't take, we get the knight to d5, and then bishop can support promotion. So it's going to end like this, and white is winning. Yeah, that was a question of move orders, which is always tricky, tactics. So let's get back. Rook has to take on c6. And now we can play a8 queen. And you get the idea. King has to take, knight takes c6. And because this bishop is attacked, has to move, we get our trapped king in the corner. What if the king tries to play king b7, attacking that knight, in return trying to get out of the corner? How does white win here? The bishop f3, discovered attack. I think black can find a spot where the bishop is not getting lost to, let's say I can just go to b7. I could probably also go to h4 or something. So I'm not really going to drop the bishop here. Yeah. So the idea is we can check here on a5. King has to keep attacking the knight, and then we get a check here, defended by the bishop, and we can take the bishop. So that's also a useful idea. So, but basically the study ends like this, and then white is going to mate on b7 after the king goes to c8. Okay, so again, the same idea. So let's move forward a little bit. So this is also a very nice study, but I think I want to move forward a little bit. It has many of the same ideas, that if white can keep the pieces, then this is a mating force. But the problem is that both the bishop and that knight is hanging. So let's move on to other kinds of positions. I will skip this for now as well. It will still be in the database I send out. So now we get to positions where the king is getting mated on the edge of the board. And this is a very simplified position. And what's going on here? So the knight on a2 is hanging. So is the knight on b3. And it looks like white is about to lose his last pawn. And also black has 3 pawns on the board. So a lot of pieces hanging here. So the draw doesn't seem far off for black here. So our first move will be knight to d4. And here's the idea. If the king takes the pawn, then we take the knight, and then we are winning because we can block the pawns, and then king, bishop, knight will prevail. So black has to keep attacking that knight on d4. And now we can move our knight and maybe this knight will still be trapped on a2. That is our only hope. So if we play knight e2, for instance, then the knight can jump back to b4. And then if bishop e7 check, then king can still go to b5. And then if we check with the knight, then king can take the pawn, still defending that knight on b4. So let's see that. That doesn't really work for white. Something like this. And black is fine. But there's a little twist to this in this position. Because white plays a6 first. Let's see, black has to take that. And now knight e2. Black is trying to save his knight. So what was white's idea here of sacrificing that a pawn? Do you see the point of that? Bishop e7 check. Yeah. You got it. Knight c3 check. The only way to keep defending the knight is king a5. And then bishop d8 is checkmate. Very nice indeed. And this is a little bit unusual, you can say, this example, because the white king is actually not playing a part. There was this pawn sacrifice, and where the black pawn is actually helping us in the checkmate. But in most of the king on the edge positions, we have the combination of these three white pieces. So this is very nice and unusual, I would say. So let's move on. Similar examples on the edge. Yeah, let's say black gives up the knight. Then the question is, it won't take more than 50 moves to collect the pawns. But if you capture something, then the 50 moves starts over. So it's not only, so you have 50 moves from the moment you capture the last pawn. And it usually takes around, let's say, between 20 and 30 moves, if you know a little bit about what you're doing with king, bishop, and knight. So the 50 move rule is without a pawn having moved and without having a capture on the board. So, okay, what about this one? So let's have a look at this one. This is a typical example, I would say. Let's get some idea to get this study started off. So there's a couple of special features for these studies. So often they have a soft start just to get going with the study. It's not like you don't start with a promotion or a capture. That's usually regarded as a little bit too, what should I say, too brutal. So a good study starts out a little more softly, then you get going. And all pieces usually matters in these studies. And yeah. Yes. So we start out with bishop e4. And if the king goes to h2, then we have knight f1 checkmate. Okay, so black has to give up the rook. We take it. Then we check. And then king to h3. So now the king is boxed in on the edge. So how do we create a mate here? We need the right setup. Yeah. So we need the king to f3. That is correct. And then we need the bishop on g2. So how do we make this happen? See, the problem is if we move the bishop back here. Yeah, Matt, you're right. Then bishop h2 to prevent the king from going to f4. And then if the king tries, yeah, that doesn't work. Then the king goes out. It can even go to g2, but also g4. So we need to go to h1. And now the idea is to get the king to f3. So this is black's best defense. And so in these studies, now we're combining ideas because it's not only about pure mate. Now black was actually forced to put that bishop on h2, where it's attacked by the knight. So here we can play king e4. And now black can, of course, escape, but then we win the endgame. So, so the black king cannot really escape. So we're still combining ideas. Let's say bishop has to move somewhere. And then we play king f3. And we have our, let's say, usual mating pattern with these three pieces. Okay, that was a nice little study by Trotsky. Oh. I'm going to skip this one. There is actually a mistake in this study, but the idea is still very good. So black is about to take this last pawn, then it will be a draw. So white's first move is to play knight g2 to defend it. And then black is trying to capture it. And notice that the bishop started on b8, had to go to g3. There's no time to, let's say, black would love to be on this diagonal because it's longer. Turns out that this one is going to be very short, only 4 squares. Oh. So bishop g3. So the thing about a diagonal being 4 squares long is it can be controlled by king and the knight because they can each control 2 squares. So bishop has to go to g3 and then bishop e2. And then the idea of the study was that bishop takes h4, check, king has now to go to g5. And this curious setup is actually going to cost black the bishop. So let's see. We just have to make a few waiting moves here. King f3. So the bishop cannot go to g3. And let's say if king h5 now, then we have king f4 with a check and we win the bishop. So black moves the pawn. But here we can check from the other side. And now we have to make sure that black doesn't escape like this. So, but we can play bishop e8. And black is losing the bishop. So there's quite a lot of studies like this that ends up in a position like this with the bishop on the edge being trapped on a diagonal too short. The mistake in the study is after bishop c2, black can play king g4 first. And then apparently, yeah, now the king goes out. Now I'm just thinking about a few details here that I'm suddenly not so sure of. but I will definitely make some comments about it in the database I sent out. I just suddenly saw some ideas like bishop d1, and if you want to keep attacking that pawn, then if you go here, then maybe your king could get in some kind of trouble. The engine says it's a draw, but there's a few details I want to sort out, and I'm going to put it in the database. I got a move in the chat. What was that? Instead of bishop c2, king f3 suggested. And if I play bishop take h4, then king f4. How are you going to control my king? You're on a dark square, so I'm probably going to give you checks in a minute. Let's see. Maybe even here is better than f2, because then I can kick you away from that square. It seems like I can run somewhere. Yeah. Okay, so the idea was great, and this idea has been seen in many studies, but in this particular study, there's a slight mistake. Okay, let's not go too much into this. I just want to show you that this is more like a real endgame position. This is what I talked about. So we have the opposite colored bishop. We have one pawn each. If white tries to take this pawn directly with a knight, then bishop takes, king takes, then it's suddenly the wrong corner here with and not winning. So that's the danger. So white has to be careful here, but black cannot, let's say, run out of the corner, because then white just wins this pawn. Even though black can give up the bishop for the knight, then the king is out of the corner, so there's no stalemate. And this is black's dilemma. So he has to stay in the corner to make sure that white doesn't win that pawn. But then when he stays in the corner, there are all kinds of mating threats. So these positions, with a little bit of care, then white usually wins. And there are also a few studies actually where instead of the pawns being here, even if they are moved back here, it is actually winning, but a little more complicated, because otherwise the pawns are further back. So when you take the pawn, you have to make it's more difficult to make sure the king doesn't stay in the corner. There's simply more space for the black king, so it's not so easy to create mating threats. But nonetheless, that is even a win. I just took this one example. So let's just see this very briefly. So let's say white gets the knight to c5, and let's see what dilemma that we put black in by doing that. So let's say check, king d8, and then knight c5. And this is the dilemma, because if the black king goes out here, then we are going to go like this. And then the king is out of the corner when we take that a6 pawn. Okay, so the black king has to stay in the corner, but that is also dangerous with so little space. King b8. Now we get our king to b c7 and b6. Something like this. And now basically we just need the knight to c7 and the bishop to e5. Then black is in trouble. So the following line shows it. Bishop to e5, let's say. And here comes knight c7, and then we take a6 with a discovered check. And then black doesn't have a chance to trade bishop for knight. Something like this. And this is a check. And this is just winning for white. Okay, so the white side usually finds a way in positions with one pawn each, opposite colored bishop, and even though the bishop has the wrong corner, wrong color compared to the corner. So it's useful to know. And one of the positions in the puzzle sheet is a position like that. Okay, We move on. Yeah, this is also a very nice study. I want to move on now because I would like to get to positions with more pieces, more minor pieces. And then we have to consider when we start to trade down pieces that we still have the right pieces to win the position. And there are quite a few positions like this. This is 3 versus 2 minor pieces. And I found a few where there's 4 versus 3 minor pieces from the beginning of the study, which is very unusual. But let's see. Here, white starts out with knight to d5. So we notice that the black king is in the corner of the white bishop. So if the king stays in that corner and we can box it in, then we are winning. And we have some pair of opposite colored bishops. So what is white trying to do here? So knight d5. What kind of trade would white wish in this position? Yep. Yeah, you both got the right idea here. So if we can get this knight to b6 and trade it for this bishop and then play king a6, then we are winning. So it's going to be a mate with that bishop coming to b7. So that is why, to prevent knight b6, black plays bishop c7. Now we have to be a little careful because black has a defense now, maybe, and then the bishop can come out. So white relocates that bishop, and after king c8, we have bishop g4. King has to go back. And then a waiting move, like this. So again, it turns out that this 4-square diagonal is too short. So black has to give up now the control of b6. There are no other moves with this strange setup of bishop, king, king, knight, and bishop on f5. So black is in Zugzwang here. So now we are going to get the trade we want. So let's see, bishop has to move. And then knight b6, knight takes a8. And again, this configuration is winning for white. This is simply a mating force that white has, so black has to take the knight. And then king a6, and mate in further 2 moves on b7. So, very nice idea. Let's move on. So here we have something similar with a couple of pawns on the board. And now we have our theme in mind. So let's see if you can get off to a start in this study. So in an endgame study, it's always interesting to consider why. So the pieces are always there for a reason. So the reason why he put in 2 pawns here, I'm actually not sure. I haven't thought about it in detail, but it's always good to consider. So I suspect that this pawn might be important to stop the bishop from going to d5, let's say. Let's say if the knight takes the bishop in the corner, then we cannot just give a check and defend it with the bishop. So that's probably the purpose of that pawn. And maybe he brought in the other pawn to it's closer to promotion, so it gives black a certain amount of counterplay. So now I'm just guessing. I actually didn't think about this before the lesson, but it's always good to think about. All pieces are there for a reason. Studies are the art of chess. Yeah. Okay, so we can actually get this knight around and take that bishop on h1, because black's pieces here are a little bit clumsy. So we start off with knight f1 check. And what happens on king d3? Yeah. Uma, you're right. What happens after king d3 here? So seeing this line now, I think I realize why that pawn is there on c6. I don't think you mean bishop d5. I think you might mean bishop f5 check. Yeah. So it is bishop f5, and the king cannot keep. I mean, if we go away, then white just takes the bishop. And compared to the main continuation, this knight is not trapped in the corner because bishop e4. So my suspicion was correct. This pawn is there for a reason from the beginning, to make sure that bishop cannot go to the long diagonal. So instead of king d3, black has to go for that knight. Still defending the bishop, of course. Then we have a check here, and then take the bishop, and then the knight is trapped in the corner. And if black can take that knight and get out again, then it's a draw. So find a way to keep that king trapped in the corner. Yeah, Matt, you got it. The key move is knight h4. That was a little bit like, you remember that study with the two knights here, and the bishop was going to win. Then we also played the knight to this a5 square, and then later it landed on c6. So it's basically the same idea. It's just mirrored versions, and down here on the bottom, knight h4 is basically the same idea. Also, nice symmetry. King takes, and then knight f3 attacking the bishop, and then bishop to h3. So now, this is not the core idea, because black has some counterplay with these pawns going down the board. And the other the other study, there was also the g pawn running down the board. So so white has to be a little careful here. So let's see, c4 and c3. Black is immediately trying to tie down the white king. King d1. So what to do now? How do we do it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my bishop would like to disturb the king on f2. So I'm not sure if we can put black in Zugzwang, because bishop can go back and forth. So I'm sitting here and thinking, because I don't quite remember it now that I have in front of me. I remember there was a twist to this study compared to the others where the king just went here and then bishop mate. And here, white has to do a little twist to make it happen. That's one of the reasons why I chose this for the presentation. It's always nice when you add more ideas to the core idea. So, but now I can't seem to find it. It's complicated. Ah, very nice. I think you're right, Matthew. So if we go to f2 and the bishop checks us out, then we can go to g3. Then the bishop can check us again. And in that moment, we can go to h3 if we move the bishop beforehand to f1. I think that is... So when we cannot keep on these squares because the bishop will... So we need to make sure this square is vacant. So that's why moving the bishop first is the right idea. That's great. Black has to wait. And now we are ready to release. Let's say if bishop tries to go on this diagonal immediately, then there's no threat of pawn promotion. So you can get it all. Here we go. Black has to check. Okay. Oh yeah, bishop e1 was tricky, but our main idea is this. And then we can go to h3, promotion, and then bishop d2. Very nice. So bishop e1 is actually a tricky defense. What do we do here? Yeah, exactly. We just take with a knight. This is what we talked about in the beginning. It doesn't matter in which order you give. Bishop check first and then knight check. So this is going to be made anyway. It's no surprise, by the way, that there's a lot of studies by Trotsky. He's one of my favorite composers for the reason that he was well known in endgame theory, and then he made all these studies where the points are always closely related to endgame theory. So you'll also learn a lot about endgame theory when you look at his studies. So he was one of the best for that. So he's in that gray area between endgame studies and endgame theory, and I really like him for that. Okay, that was a very nice point here. Let's try to move on. Okay, we're going to skip this for now. I want to make sure I show you this by Kasparian. 4 against 3. And there are not a lot of those compared to the others when I look through the database. So let's try to figure out what's going on here. And we also have to think about what we can trade down to when it's still winning. So it's complicated. There are more transformation now with more pieces on the board. So the first move is, so the knight on f3 is hanging and the bishops are attacking each other. This bishop is eyeing both this knight and this knight. And the king is on the edge of the board. There's a lot of things going on. The first move, is knight to d4. And now we are attacking the knight on g2. We are also toying with the idea of knight f5. Check. Let's just see for a moment that now knight h4 is our main move, to move the knight out of the way and defend that square f5. Let's see what happens if black takes that knight. Oh, sorry. Then we can take back with a knight, and then we have a fork on these two knights. So that doesn't work. So black has to go knight h4. Then we play bishop h4, putting pressure on the knight with the idea of knight f5. Check. And again, black cannot simplify with bishop takes, because again, we have this idea, and now we are attacking both knights again. So bishop f2. Yeah, king h5 is no good. We have this fork. And if bishop takes d4, then we have again this knight hanging on g8. So this bishop takes d4 doesn't really work. So after bishop takes h4, yeah, then king takes, and then we have the fork. Okay, so black is not going to play king to h5, but bishop f2 to defend that knight. Bishop takes h4. So I know we've seen a lot of studies so far, and they're also in the puzzles. But the idea of, you might think these are all crazy ideas, but the idea of getting into opposite colored bishops, even with reduced material, and then looking for mates, it's very useful to think like this. So opposite colored bishop doesn't. It's not only with the queens on and everything. It's actually a universal attacking idea. So let's see. Knight f5 check. King has to go to h5 now to defend the bishop. And now we're starting to get to the point where it gets very pretty. So how can white put more pressure on black here? Give me some good ideas. Yeah, Omar, that's a very good idea. Knights defending each other. The g8 knight is hanging. So that wins a piece. Then black can try a defense after that, but that is winning a piece to begin with. So we can give a check here. Now we basically have, if king g5 here, we just take the knight, and there's no really, this is just winning for white. Assuming that this pawn doesn't become dangerous, again, we have the opposite colored bishop with two knights, which is winning. So black has to try to get back some material. King to g6, bishop takes g8, and now bishop f6. And now what? Maybe we can give up that knight to on g7 to trap the black king. Knight to e6. So it turns out that white is keeping his pieces after all. What happens on king takes f5? Yeah, this is great. Bishop h7, right? But this is actually not the most beautiful idea. So this is Kasparian. So he had another couple of studies where he had beautiful ideas. So bishop f6. Okay, knight e6. This is a very beautiful mate. Okay, but look at this one. If bishop g5, and then I don't know, black is maybe hoping for bishop h6 or just moving the pawn forward. White is kind of tied down here. But I have only seen this theme once by Kasparian. I was in the 1930s, I believe. And then there was some other guy that had a study 7 years later, I believe, based on this theme. But this position after knight h5, this is really the pretty one. So if black does nothing, then white can just play, let's say, knight g3 or something. So knights defending each other, no problems. And black cannot take any of these knights. Why not? Yes, this is very nice. There are mirror mates. Yeah, exactly. So let's see them. King takes here, this is mate. And if king takes f5, we have bishop h7 mate. So this is just a very nice picture. It's a very typical Kasparian. Yeah. There's another famous study of his where he has a similar picture. Okay, so adding more minor pieces on the board is interesting because somehow we get it down to the core idea of bishop knight versus opposite colored bishops, or some of these configurations with 3 minor pieces versus 2 that we also looked at, or 3 minor pieces versus 1. So it's interesting when there's a lot of minor pieces on the board, and I believe a couple of the studies at a couple of the puzzles at the end you got also have many minor pieces on the board. So that was it for the presentation. I showed you a little bit of everything, and now you should be more ready to do the puzzles if you didn't already look a little bit into them. So we go off online. We go offline for half an hour now, and see you back at 8:30. If you have any question before we do that, you can put it in the chat. But otherwise, I'll just see you in half an hour. Okay.